From the outside, my life looked settled, predictable, safe, the kind of life people nodded at with approval. I had a steady career, a warm home, and a marriage that had survived more than a decade. Daniel and Emily, two names that sounded solid together. We weren't dramatic. We didn't fight loudly. We paid our bills on time. We planned ahead. Stability had become our love language. But stability can hide cracks when you stop looking too closely. It started with small things. Things too small to accuse, too quiet to confront. Emily began coming home later than usual, always with a reasonable explanation. A meeting ran long. A client call from another time zone. A sudden project that couldn't wait. I believed her, because belief was easier than doubt, and because I loved her. Her phone became something she guarded without realizing it. The screen tilted away from me. Notifications silenced the moment I entered a room. When I asked how her day was, her answers changed. They weren't stories anymore. They were summaries. Bullet points. Corporate language followed her home. Stripped of emotion. Productive, challenging, good exposure. Exposure. That word stayed with me. She used to talk about people, about moments, about how things made her feel. Now she talked like she was still in the office, like she was presenting a report instead of sharing a life. I told myself this was growth, ambition, success. That's what good husbands do, right? They support. They don't question every change. They don't let insecurity poison trust. Still, there were moments, quiet, private moments, when my chest felt heavier than it should have. Emily stopped asking about my day, not intentionally, just gradually. Conversations became functional. Who was picking up groceries? What time the bills were due? Whether I could handle dinner because she'd be late again? Late again? When the invitation came, it arrived wrapped in excitement. She told me about it over breakfast, eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in months. My boss is hosting a dinner for senior staff. She said, spouses are invited. It's kind of a big deal. Her boss, Mark Reynolds. I'd heard the name often enough to recognize its importance. He was the reason she stayed late. The reason projects were suddenly urgent. The reason her voice changed when she talked about work. It's a good sign for my career, she added quickly, as if she needed my approval more than my presence. I smiled. Of course I did. I told her I was proud of her, that she deserved recognition, that I'd be happy to go. But something in me stayed quiet, observant. The day of the dinner, Emily took longer getting ready than usual. She dressed carefully, too carefully, not overdressed, just intentional. When she caught me watching, she smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. Mostly, the restaurant was upscale, polished, filled with low voices and expensive laughter. The kind of place where reputations mattered, where people performed versions of themselves they wanted remembered. Then I saw him. Mark Reynolds stood near the center of the room, confident, effortless, commanding attention without asking for it. When Emily spotted him, her posture changed, just slightly. Her shoulders straightened, her expression softened, and then it happened. She looked at him, just a second too long. Not inappropriate, not obvious, but intimate in a way that doesn't belong in professional spaces or married ones. In that moment, standing at the entrance of that restaurant, I understood something I couldn't yet prove. The life I thought I was living might already be over. Mark Reynolds didn't walk into the room, he claimed it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing confidence the way some men wear tailored suits, loud without being crude, charismatic without trying, the kind of man people laughed with a little too eagerly, as if approval from him meant something extra. This was the man I'd heard so much about. When Emily introduced us, Mark's smile widened, not because he was pleased to meet me, but because he'd already decided what I was. His handshake lingered a second longer than necessary, grip firm, testing. Daniel, he said, nodding. Good to finally meet the man behind the scenes. Behind the scenes? It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. He spoke over me, not to me. His attention drifted back to Emily almost immediately, asking about deadlines, projects, inside jokes I wasn't part of. I stood there, present but invisible, like furniture. I didn't interrupt. I didn't compete. I watched. Mark leaned in when he spoke to Emily, too close for comfort. Close enough that I noticed the faint pause in her breathing. At one point, he touched her arm lightly while laughing, as if it were natural, familiar. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She simply stayed still. That stillness hurt more than a flinch would have. We were seated at a long table with other couples managers, executives, people who understood the unspoken rules of hierarchy. Conversations overlapped. Wine flowed. Laughter came easily. But beneath it all, I felt the tension tightening, like a wire drawn too thin. Mark made sure to sit across from Emily. Not beside his own date, no. She was placed conveniently elsewhere, but directly where he could hold Emily's attention. His eyes returned to her again and again, as if magnetized. When he addressed me, it was always public, performative. You must be proud, he said loudly at one point, raising his glass slightly. Emily's one of our brightest talents. Dedicated, reliable, always available, always available. A few heads turned. A couple of polite smiles followed. Someone laughed, unsure whether it was a joke. I smiled too, calm, controlled, because reacting would have given him exactly what he wanted. Mark thrived on dominance, on subtle humiliation masked as praise. He didn't need to insult me outright. He simply erased me from relevance. I noticed how other husbands shifted in their seats, how wives exchanged brief glances before returning to their plates. Everyone saw it. No one said anything, because power makes cowards out of witnesses. As the evening progressed, Mark grew bolder, his chair angled closer to Emily's. His voice dropped when he spoke to her, rose when addressing the table. His laughter lingered too long. At one point, as a waiter poured wine, Mark reached out casually, confidently, and brushed Emily's wrist. It was a small gesture, intimate, intentional. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I didn't move. I didn't speak. I met Emily's eyes briefly. She looked away. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Mark mistook my silence for weakness. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his smile sharpened. He believed he'd already won, simply because I wasn't fighting. But restraint isn't surrender. The room buzzed with conversation as Mark stood, glass in hand, commanding attention once more. To growth, he said, voice smooth, to chemistry, to opportunities that surprise us. He turned slowly, his eyes locked on Emily, and he smiled. Mark didn't lower his glass when he spoke. He held it steady, elbow slightly bent. The picture of confidence of a man who believed every room he entered belonged to him. Conversations around the table thinned, laughter trailing off as people sensed a shift. The air tightened. Emily, Mark said, his tone warm, deliberate, you know, we talk a lot about productivity and performance in the office, but there's something else I've noticed. My name was never mentioned. Emily looked up, surprise flickering across her face. She smiled politely, the way people do when they don't yet realize they're being cornered. What's that? She asked. Chemistry, Mark replied smoothly, the kind that doesn't show up on spreadsheets. A few forced chuckles followed. Nervous ones. Someone cleared their throat. I felt the table vibrate under my fingertips as I tightened my grip. Mark continued, undeterred. I admire ambition, but I admire connection even more. And I think you and I, well, we have something worth exploring. Outside the office? Outside the office. The words landed like glass shattering in slow motion. No one spoke. I could hear the hum of the lights above us, the faint clink of silverware from another table. My own breathing, steady, controlled, louder than it should have been. Mark turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge my presence without actually addressing me. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second, assessing, measuring. Then he looked back at Emily. Just dinner, he added casually, somewhere quieter. No pressure. I think it could be enlightening. Enlightening. Emily froze. Her smile faltered, caught halfway between politeness and panic. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't say no. She didn't say anything at all. Seconds passed, maybe 3, maybe 5. Long enough to feel like an eternity. I waited for her to shut it down, to remind him I was her husband, to draw the line that should never have been crossed in the first place. She didn't. Her eyes darted briefly toward me, then back to Mark. Confusion, fear, something else I didn't want to name. That hesitation hurt more than the question itself. Around us, the table had gone completely still. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses hovered just above tablecloths. Other couples stared at their plates, pretending not to notice the moment unraveling in front of them. This wasn't flirtation anymore. This was humiliation. Mark stood there comfortably, waiting. He assumed silence meant acceptance. He assumed I'd either lash out, proving his superiority, or shrink back, confirming it. I felt the weight of every eye in the room, even the ones refusing to look directly at us. This was public, deliberate, a display. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and cold. This hadn't been spontaneous. He'd planned this. The late nights, the confidence, the way he touched her arm, the way he spoke about availability. This was a man testing boundaries because he believed none applied to him, and the worst part, he believed I wouldn't stop him. I looked at Emily again. Really looked. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap now, knuckles pale. She was breathing, trapped between her boss and her husband, between ambition and loyalty, and she was silent. Silence can mean many things. Fear, confusion, guilt, or permission. I felt something break, not loudly, not dramatically but cleanly, like a thread finally snapping under too much strain. Mark smiled, sensing control. No rush, he said lightly. Think about it. He raised his glass again, sealing the moment like a toast. That's when it happened. Every head at the table turned toward me. They were waiting for anger, for shouting, for a scene, waiting for me to explode. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't stand up, I didn't reach for my glass or clench my fists, or give Mark Reynolds the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply looked at him. The room waited for an explosion. Instead, it got silence. Not the awkward kind, not the confused kind, the deliberate kind. Mark, I said calmly, my voice even, almost polite. Can I ask you something? He blinked. Just once. It was subtle, but it was there. Of course, he replied, smile still in place. Anything, I nodded, as if we were discussing quarterly reports. You mentioned chemistry and professional admiration. I'm curious, when did those conversations stop being about work hours? A few people shifted in their seats. Mark chuckled lightly. Oh, come on, this is just conversation. Nothing inappropriate, right? I said. Then I must be mistaken. He tilted his head. About what? About the number of times my wife's calendar showed late review meetings that never appeared on the company's schedule. Emily stiffened. Mark's smile thinned and not gone, but tighter now. Schedules change, he said. You know how corporate life is. I do, I agreed. That's why I checked. The table was silent again, but this time it wasn't waiting for violence. It was leaning in. Mark shifted in his chair. The first real movement I'd seen from him all evening. I think this is getting a bit personal, he said, voice still smooth but a fraction louder. I agree, I replied. It became personal when you invited my wife out in front of me. There it was. Direct.com. Unavoidable. Mark cleared his throat. Daniel, no offense, but you're reading too much into this. Maybe, I said. That's why I'm asking questions instead of making accusations. Emily finally looked at me. Really looked. Her eyes widened, slightly not with anger, but recognition. She was starting to understand something. I wasn't guessing, I continued. Measured. You said this was spontaneous, that you were surprised by your own feelings. Yet you chose tonight, a public dinner, spouses present. That's an interesting choice for a private realization. Mark laughed, but it came out wrong. Forced. You're over-analyzing, am I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks rehearsed. Someone at the far end of the table shifted their glass away, as if distancing themselves from what was unfolding. Mark leaned back, crossing his arms, defensive now. I don't appreciate being interrogated. I don't appreciate my marriage being tested like a negotiation, I replied. Still calm. That was when I saw it. The flicker of uncertainty. Mark was used to dominance, used to intimidation, used to men reacting emotionally so he could dismiss them as unstable. But this composure didn't fit his playbook. Emily's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She knew I had been paying attention in ways she hadn't expected. That I had noticed patterns. That I had stayed quiet not because I was blind, but because I was patient. I turned to her briefly. You told me those late nights started in March, I said gently. Her breath caught. And yet, I added, looking back at Mark, your department restructuring wasn't approved until May. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was threatening. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time all evening, he didn't have a ready answer. Eyes around the table widened. Someone swallowed audibly. A wife reached for her husband's hand. Emily stared at me now, fear and realization colliding in her expression, because she understood something in that moment. I knew more than I was saying. And Mark Reynolds, the man who thought he owned the room, had just realized he wasn't in control anymore. I hadn't planned to say any of it out loud. Not tonight. Not like this. But Mark's silence, thick, defensive, told me something important. The man who thrived on control had finally lost his footing. And once a bully realizes the room is no longer his, the truth has a way of surfacing on its own. I didn't start paying attention because I was suspicious. I said, my voice still steady. I started because things stopped adding up. Mark shifted again, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound echoed more than it should have. Emily stared straight ahead now, her lips pressed together, eyes glassy. She knew where this was going. She just hadn't believed I would take it this far. For months, I continued. Emily came home later and later, always with explanations that made sense on their own but never together. I paused, letting that settle. Meetings that ran long, dinners that became strategy sessions, calls that couldn't wait. Mark scoffed. That's corporate life. So I thought. I replied, until I noticed the patterns. I reached into my jacket not dramatically, not threateningly, and placed my phone on the table. I didn't unlock it. I didn't need to. Late nights, I said, always on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Deleted messages that reappeared as gaps and backups. Calendar entries labeled vaguely enough to avoid questions. Emily's breath hitched. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're crossing a line. You crossed it first, I answered. I'm just mapping it. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved closer. No one interrupted. No one defended him. And then there were the policies, I added. Company rules about supervisor-subordinate relationships. Disclosure requirements. Power imbalance clauses. Mark's jaw tightened. I didn't have to dig far. I said, because this wasn't the first time, was it? That did it? The color drained from his face, not all at once, but enough to notice. Enough for everyone else to notice too. A woman 2 seats down looked sharply at Mark. A man across the table frowned, realization dawning. Emily finally broke. Her shoulders sagged, the strength draining out of her posture. Tears welled, spilling before she could stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she whispered. I was scared. I didn't know how to stop it. That confession soft fractured cut deeper than anything Mark had said. I closed my eyes briefly. Just a second. Long enough to steady myself. Fear, guilt, ambition. They'd braided themselves into something ugly. Mark stood abruptly. This is inappropriate, he snapped. We're not doing this here. But the authority was gone from his voice. Stripped away. This was your choice of venue, I reminded him. Public. Remember? He looked around, searching for allies. Found none. Faces were tight, expressions guarded. People were mentally distancing themselves, already calculating consequences. Emily looked up at me, tears streaking her face. Daniel, please. I looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity. I asked you once if there was anything I needed to know, I said quietly. You said no. She lowered her head. That was the final confirmation. Not suspicion. Not intuition. Truth. I felt the grief settle in, not explosive, not wild but heavy, and final. Like mourning something that had already been gone for months. Mark sank back into his chair, defeated. The room had shifted around him. He was no longer the center, just a man exposed. I stood. The movement was simple, unhurried, but it commanded attention more than any shout could have. I straightened my jacket, looked at Mark, then at Emily, and I said one sentence. Calm, clear, and irreversible. This conversation isn't ending tonight, it's just beginning. I didn't sit back down. There was nothing left to debate, nothing left to explain. The truth had surfaced, and now it simply needed room to breathe. I want to be clear, I said, not raising my voice, not looking for approval. This isn't an emotional reaction. Mark scoffed weakly. You think you're going to ruin my career over a misunderstanding? I turned to him fully for the first time that night. Not with anger, with calm certainty. No, I said. Your choices did that. I reached into my jacket again, and this time placed a folded envelope on the table. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Human Resources received a report 3 weeks ago, I continued, along with supporting documentation, dates, communications, policy references. Legal counsel copied. Mark's face went still. I didn't submit it anonymously, I added. I signed my name. A ripple moved through the table, not sound, but recognition. A few guests glanced at one another, already connecting dots. Corporate dinners had a way of turning into courtrooms when evidence appeared.
You planned this,
Mark muttered. I prepared, I corrected. There's a difference. Emily stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Her breathing quickened. I gave you time, I said softly to her. Time to be honest. Time to step away. She covered her face, shoulders shaking. I didn't think you'd actually do it. That, I replied, is the problem. Mark pushed his chair back again, but this time there was no authority in the movement, only panic. This is ridiculous, he said, louder now. Nothing's proven. It will be, I said. Company devices are easier to audit than people realize. No one laughed. No one challenged me, because they all knew it was true. One couple stood quietly, murmuring excuses about an early morning meeting. Another followed. Chairs slid back softly. Coats were gathered. Goodbyes were brief, awkward, final. No one looked at Mark as they left. Not a single person defended him. His power evaporated not in a scandal, but in silence. Emily reached for my arm. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. I simply looked at her hand, resting there, trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't see how much I was losing. I met her eyes. You did? I said. You just thought I wouldn't notice. That landed harder than anger ever could. Mark sat alone now, staring at the table, jaw clenched. The man who once owned the room couldn't even hold its attention. I turned away from both of them. No victory speech, no threats, no satisfaction displayed, just resolve. I nodded to the waiter, paid the bill calmly, and picked up my coat. As I walked toward the exit, the room felt lighter, quieter, like something toxic had been removed. I didn't look back. The door closed behind me with a soft click, not a slam, and I walked out alone. The night air felt colder than I expected. Not sharp, just honest. I stood outside the restaurant for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the noise of the city settle around me. No cheers, no applause. Just the quiet aftermath of a decision that couldn't be undone. People think walking away feels like defeat. They imagine anger, bitterness, loneliness, swallowing you whole. But what I felt wasn't any of that. It was sadness, yes, but clean, untangled. The kind that comes when you stop fighting reality. I drove home slowly, hands steady on the wheel. Every streetlight passed like a checkpoint, marking distance between the man I had been and the one I needed to become. When I opened the door, the house was silent, familiar, too familiar. I walked through each room, noticing the details I'd once taken for granted, the framed photos, the half-finished projects, the quiet corners, where laughter used to live. This place held memories, not promises anymore. My son's room was the hardest. I stood in the doorway and watched him sleep, chest rising and falling, unaware of how close his world had come to collapsing. Children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones, safe ones. That clarity settled everything. Emily called the next morning. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Stripped of confidence, of certainty. I made a mistake, she said. I'll do anything to fix this. I closed my eyes. I believe you believe that, I replied. But fixing something means it still exists. Silence stretched between us. I was afraid, she whispered, of losing my job, of losing myself. And now, I asked, I'm afraid of losing you. I looked at the calendar, on the wall. Dates filled with routines, not hope. You lost me the moment honesty became optional, I said gently. I just took longer to say it out loud. She cried then. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way people do when they finally understand consequences. We met once more, only once, to discuss logistics. No shouting, no blame, just clarity. She reached for my hand near the end, searching for something familiar. I didn't pull away, I just didn't hold on. Choosing peace isn't dramatic, it's deliberate. Days passed, then weeks. The silence in the house changed. It stopped feeling empty and started feeling calm. I cooked dinner without rushing. I read before bed. I listened to myself. Strength, I learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up quietly, in routines, in boundaries, kept, in mornings that don't hurt as much as the last. I didn't win, but I didn't lose either. I protected what mattered, and in doing so, I became someone my son could grow up respecting, not because I stayed, but because I knew when to leave. One evening, sitting alone, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. That's when I knew I'd healed. I looked up from the window, the city glowing beyond the glass. And for the first time since that dinner, I spoke not to the past, not to Emily, but to you. Because if you're reading this, you might be standing where I once stood. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine sitting across from someone you love, someone you've trusted with your life, and watching a third person, someone who thinks power is permission, step in and erase your place in that relationship. Not with force, not with threats, but with charm, confidence, and arrogance. That's what happened to me. Most people would explode, yell, accuse, make a scene. And for a moment, I considered it. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the rush of anger and betrayal, the temptation to strike back with words sharper than steel. But I didn't, because silence is not weakness. Silence is discipline. Silence is power measured and controlled. I watched, I waited, I observed, every pattern, every detail, every step that led to that moment. And when the time came, I spoke not with volume, but with clarity, precision, and undeniable truth. There's a lesson here. One I learned at the expense of trust and love I thought would last forever. Love without honesty is betrayal. No amount of charm, no corporate hierarchy, no clever excuse can replace the damage caused by lies, by deceit, by pretending boundaries don't exist. And I want you to hear this clearly. Children pay for adult lies. My son didn't know what had happened at that dinner. He didn't need to, but he already senses the tension, the absence of truth, the unspoken fractures in life around him. Protecting them, ISNT, just about shielding them from the world that S about standing for integrity even when it hurts, even when it costs you everything else. Walking away doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't feel righteous at first. It feels lonely. It feels painful. But walking away, when done from a place of strength, can be the strongest form of revenge. Not revenge that humiliates, not revenge that harms, but revenge that reclaims your dignity, your peace, your self-respect, that shows anyone who thought they could control or manipulate you that power belongs only to those who honor it responsibly. I chose dignity over drama, clarity over chaos, silence over futile argument. And in that choice, I discovered something incredible: freedom, peace, strength. Not the kind that shouts, not the kind that hurts, but the kind that endures. Now, I want to speak to you directly. Have you ever been underestimated, thought powerless, pushed into silence because speaking would seem weak? Or maybe you stayed quiet because you didn't yet understand the weight of the truth around you? I know what that feels like. I know the burning tension of being forced to choose between rage and reason, between action and patience. And I know how powerful it feels when the quiet finally speaks louder than anything else in the room. So I ask you, what would you have done if you were me? Would you have reacted differently, stayed silent, confronted with anger, walked away? Share your story. Someone out there needs to hear it. Someone out there is standing in that same silent tension, wondering if strength looks like shouting or waiting, watching, and acting only when the time is right. Because strength isn't measured by noise. It's measured by boundaries, by clarity, by the courage to protect what matters most, even when it hurts. Remember this: love without honesty is betrayal. Silence is not weakness, it's discipline. Children pay for adult lies. Walking away can be the strongest revenge. And above all else, your dignity, your peace, your integrity, they are worth more than any fleeting moment of confrontation. So tell me, what would you do? Someone needs your answer. Someone needs your courage. And now, it's your turn.